Good morning to all of you. All delegates are requested to come into the hall and be seated. Our first speaker for the day is Bob Gill, GM, ARC Southeast Asia. He manages ARC's business operations and market research activities in Southeast Asia. He joined ARC in 2014 after a decade-long career in industrial technology media, most recently as editor-in-chief at Singapore's Continuo Media. He is a qualified engineer with 15 years' experience in automation, manufacturing, and logistics. Please welcome Bob on stage.
Okay, thank you, Sharada, and it's certainly a pleasure to be in Bangalore for the first time and to be here at the ARC India Forum, the 14th forum for my colleagues in India. So, as Sharada mentioned, I'm based in Singapore, so I look after market research and business development for ARC Advisory Group for the Southeast Asia region. And last week, I attended an event by a company called Pills, which is, some of you may be familiar with this company. It's a German safety automation specialist. And they were having a launch event for their new office in Singapore, which is their first subsidiary outside of, first subsidiary in the Southeast Asia region. And they have offices around the world, including India, China, and in a few. And this is Mrs. Pills, who's the owner and CEO of the company. And she flew down from Germany to be at this event in Singapore last week. And this is what she said during her speech. We established subsidiaries after careful consideration. Southeast Asia is one of the world's fastest growing economic regions. So this is just an example Southeast Asia as an opportunity, as an area of growth for them. And as I said, just one example, and many, many other companies are looking at Southeast Asia for future opportunities and future growth. And especially, I think, from the year 2000, when people talked about Asia, it was very much about China and India, and quite understandably that was the case. But I think more recently, and especially since around 2010-11, Southeast Asia has taken a lot more of the mind share, and people are talking a lot more about Southeast Asia in pretty much the same way they did earlier about India and China. So, but when I go around talking about my role or my job at ARC, I often assume people understand Southeast Asia, what Southeast Asia is, but I'm often surprised that sometimes this information is lacking about what actually constitutes Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia really constitutes of 10 countries. So I've got 10 fingers, or 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. So if you can shout out what you think are the countries in Southeast Asia, let's see if we can get to the 10 countries. Sorry? Thailand, Malaysia? Sorry? Philippines? Vietnam? Indonesia? Singapore? India's not, is that? No. Malaysia? Myanmar? Laos? 2 more? Yeah, Cambodia. And 1 more, yeah, Brunei. So those are the, well done, yeah. You did a lot better than my audience in Japan a couple of years ago. So I think they got 8. So yeah, so these are the 10 countries that make up Southeast Asia. And I think one characteristic about the Southeast Asia region is it's a very diverse area of the world in terms of physical size, in terms of population, in terms of language, religion, business culture. But there are many, many factors which are making companies and economists and analysts are very positive about this region, and especially in terms of industrial activity and opportunities for automation suppliers. So I'll talk about some of these factors during my presentation. And the first thing is around population. So the current population of Southeast Asia, of those 10 countries that I mentioned, is around 630 million people. But over the next 20 years, that population will grow, will increase by more than 100 million to reach over 740 million people. And the reason why that's important is because there are many areas of the world where they are facing declining populations or stagnating populations. And here I'm talking about countries like China or Eastern Europe, South America. Japan, of course, is famous for its low fertility rate. And it's also the right kind of population growth, so what's called the demographic dividend. So this is accompanied by the increase in the working age population. So that's the population that works and that consumes in the economy. And that's going to peak over the next 10 years, especially in countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia. And as I said, these are the people who will consume things like cars or pharmaceuticals or more sophisticated food and beverages, things which are manufactured. And they will also, of course, be part of the labor force. And second factor is these are significant manufacturing economies. You can see here, as a percentage of GDP, these are all pretty high, from Thailand above 30%, and then several countries in the mid 20% percentages of GDP. And this is a really a historical reason. When these companies were first industrializing, a lot of foreign direct investment came in from countries like US and Japan in electronics, and then later the automotive industry, for example, came to Japan. And that's still very much the case. And in fact, the foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia is now greater than it is in China. Another important factor here is, historically, again, a lot of the goods were exported outside of the region. But now, because of the growth of the economies, a lot of the goods that are made in Southeast Asia are consumed within the region or outside, close within Asia itself. So there's a growth of what's called intra-ASEAN trade and also intra-Asia trade as a result of this manufacturing activity. Another factor is around urbanization and infrastructure. So this is pretty much in line with what's happening elsewhere in the developing world, where people move from villages and towns, move to the city. I'm not an expert on Bangalore, but I would guess pretty much the same thing is happening here, where the city's probably grown quite significantly over the last 20 years. People have moved here for work. The infrastructure's had to grow in terms of roads and rail and transportation. And that's very much the case in many cities around Southeast Asia, like Jakarta, Manila, Kuala Lumpur. They're all facing growth in populations and require extensive infrastructure to support that kind of growth. So again, I'm talking about power, roads, rail, buildings, transportation, ports, airports. All those kinds of facilities are required in Southeast Asia. And that quote at the top is from McKinsey, and they estimated 7 trillion in investment is required in Southeast Asia over the next couple of decades. Another factor is around natural resources. So plentiful natural resources, oil and gas, coal, copper, nickel, palm oil, sugar, cocoa, all those commodities are in quite plentiful supply, particularly in places like Indonesia and the Philippines, Malaysia. So again, this presents an opportunity for industrial activity and also for automation activity as well, in extraction in terms of processing minerals as well, palm oil processing, for example. So you can see those four factors at work driving industrialization activity in this region we call Southeast Asia. So if we take a closer look at the economy, so right now the GDP as a block is around $2.5 trillion, and that's around about 97% of that is generated by the six major economies of Southeast Asia, which you can see listed here, and they're followed by what I call the smaller economies of Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei. And this 2.5 trillion has almost double that of what the figure was about 5 years ago. So you can see the growth in the GDP as a block. And the forecasts are for this total GDP to increase again by 2030, depending on which forecast you look at, but should be in the region again of $5 to $6 trillion. And forecasts are for this to be the fourth largest economy by GDP by 2030. Okay, so that's an indication of the size of the economies. And if you compare that to some of the other major areas around the world, so right now, Southeast Asia is the sixth largest economy. So it trails UK, Germany, Japan, and then very, 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 very far ahead is China and the US. So as I said, this is also going to increase as we go ahead, especially over the next 15 years. Okay. And as I said, really, we can segment Southeast Asia into these two sectors. The major economies, which are over $100 billion in GDP, and the smaller economies, which are less than $100 billion. And on this chart, you can also see the growth rates, which are pretty respectable, I would say. You're talking about 6-7%, 6-7%, 5-3-4%, but particularly in the more emerging, what are called frontier economies of Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, you're seeing 7-8%, obviously from a very, very low base, but again, growing quite healthy levels. So I'll talk about the countries in a bit more detail here. So starting off with Vietnam, which right now is the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia, and it's seeing record foreign direct investment and export performance. I think one of the reasons why it's done so well over the last 2 years is because it's less exposed to China. And as you know, China has been slowing down quite significantly over the last 3 or 4 years. And that's affected the economies of Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, particularly. But Vietnam less so. And also, it's an increasingly desirable destination for electronics manufacturing. And much of the China-based manufacturing electronics has begun to move to Vietnam. Another positive factor for Vietnam is the free trade agreement, which has not been signed yet, and which is a bit pretty unpopular at the moment in the US, if you've been following the presidential race. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if it does go through, if it is ratified, is a very, very positive thing for Vietnam in particular. So we should hear about where this goes over the next several months. And here's an example of that electronics manufacturing that I was talking about. So 50% of Samsung mobile phones are now manufactured in Vietnam. which is quite something. Then, if we talk about, Philippines. Again, this economy has been growing at a good clip over the last 3 or 4 years. It was pretty anemic in the first decade of this century, but ramped up quite well in the second decade. Increasing government expenditure, strong domestic consumption, and the government is planning to increase its level of infrastructure spending in the economy to 5% of GDP. It's always had a low level of FDI. That's been one of the things that's held the Philippines back. And it's still the weakest of the major economies in terms of foreign direct investment. Semiconductor and electronics, they continue to be the leading manufacturing sectors in the Philippines. But the country is determined to increase its manufacturing footprint. Looking at some of the areas there, you can see around aerospace, chemicals, pulp and paper, and especially around automotive components. They're looking to increase their presence in the Philippines. Then we have, we have Malaysia. Now Malaysia's last year registered 5% growth, which historically for Malaysia was a bit low, and it's expected to decline this year again before resuming an upward trend next year in 2017. And if you were following the business news last year, you would know that the ringgit was the worst performing currency in the region last year versus the US dollar. And Malaysia has been suffering because of the oil price, essentially, because that's a huge part of the economy in Malaysia. Also Malaysia is a key trade partner for China, so China slows down, Malaysia also suffers. But again, there are sectors where the government is looking to increase manufacturing and industrial activity. Areas like pharmaceuticals, food and beverage, especially halal food, and aerospace. And just outside of Singapore, on Malaysia's southern border, there's a huge project which is going on right now called the PIPC project, which involves tens of billions of dollars to create quite a mammoth refining and petrochemical complex. So that's one project that did go ahead, even though the oil price was a problem. So looking to increase its presence in the oil and gas industry through that. Then we have Thailand. Now Thailand's was very much the star of Southeast Asia about 10, 12 years ago. It was doing really, really well. And then they started to have political problems, which I'm sure you would have heard of over the last 6 years. Of course, it's now under military rule. So that's affected the economy to a certain extent. However, there is some recovery expected this year in 2016 and going forward into 2017 of 3% growth, which is good, which is well below historical levels, but is again looking better than it was at least 2 or 3 years ago. Government is looking to increase spending. It does have some benefits itself from oil prices because it's a net importer of oil. And strong in automotive, strong in electronics. And as I mentioned before, some of that electronics is moving over to Vietnam to take account of the lower labor costs which Vietnam has over Thailand. But especially in terms of automotive, Thailand is far and away the leading automotive supplier, manufacturer within Southeast Asia. And although investment levels are not to the extent they were 10 years ago, as you can see here, Ford is investing a lot of money to expand their facility, and it's still a major sector for the country in terms of automotive, finished vehicles, and also automotive parts. And then we have Singapore, which is where I'm from. And this is an interesting area in Southeast Asia. So again, Singapore used to post growth in the region of 5-6% every year. That was kind of the average for Singapore. But recently that's come down quite a bit, and it's around 2% to 2.5% in that kind of region. It suffered generally because of the economic slowdown globally. It's very much an export-led economy, a small population, not much domestic consumption, and also affected by the China slowdown, which I mentioned earlier. So what they're trying to do in Singapore is restructure the economy, reduce reliance on foreign low-cost labor, and emphasize skills, productivity, moving up the value chain. And the government expects this 2 to 3% to be the new normal economic growth for the country. But the positive thing out of that is that the government is driving automation. They're driving automation to replace a lot of this foreign labor, to encourage companies to upgrade their facilities with automation technology. And in the recent budget, which I believe was in February or March, they allocated very generous grants for companies to implement automation and also to introduce robotics into their companies as a means of increasing productivity levels within those manufacturing facilities. And again, there are some very bright spots in manufacturing still in Singapore, around pharmaceuticals, aerospace, specialty chemicals. Solar is another area where Singapore is doing very well. And often people go to Singapore and they go to Orchard Road and they go shopping and they see big buildings and say banks. Oh, this is Singapore. But Singapore is still a very, very strong manufacturing country, and it's still the world's largest producer of oil rigs. Is from Singapore. Has a huge refinery sector. And even where I live from my house, I could walk 5 minutes down the road, I can see oil rigs being constructed. So often people don't realize that about Singapore, but still a pretty strong industrial nation. And the government wants to keep it at that level. And another area where Singapore is looking to grow is in the area of IoT, smart cities, all that side of things. And they already have a very strong ICT infrastructure, very good internet, very fast internet speeds, everything works. And the Smart Nation initiative, which was announced in 2014, is something which is quite a lot of publicity around that in Singapore, and definitely within the scope of IoT and smart cities and all that kind of technology. It's definitely the leader within Southeast Asia. And some countries are trying to follow Singapore's model in that as well. But right now, very much driving IoT in Singapore. A lot of projects, a lot of pilot projects, especially around the Internet of Things. Okay, and then I have Indonesia. So Indonesia is expected to grow about 5% this year. Again, there was a bit of a slowdown from 2013. Very much an infrastructure story around roads, rail, water, wastewater treatment, helping to boost growth. And some of the factors that I talked about earlier are very much a characteristic of Indonesia. So this rising middle class already has a huge population, and that's going to drive consumer-based manufacturing industries like automotive, like household goods, pharmaceuticals, food and beverage. Another factor is around power and energy, which I'll talk about in a minute. And Indonesia has a lot of potential, but still faces a lot of issues around investment, getting investment, around education levels. So again, a country with a lot of potential, but still some things to do around getting to where it can be in the years ahead. So a bit more details on Indonesia, because I think it's quite an interesting country. You may not know, but Indonesia is already the largest oil producer within Southeast Asia. However, especially from around the mid-1990s, there's been definite lack of investment in keeping with the levels it needs to be at in terms of upstream oil and gas exploration. So right now, the country can only meet about half of its oil demand. The rest of it has to be imported from other countries. As you can see, the production is going down while the consumption is going up. So this is an issue for Indonesia. Another area is downstream. Here, this country only has 6 oil refineries for 260 million people. Again, it cannot meet demand, has to import 600,000 barrels a day of fuel products. And there, I think, you can see that's Indonesia down here, and then Thailand and Singapore in terms of oil refining capacity. And also on gas. This is a bit of a better story for Indonesia. It's the leading producer of gas in Southeast Asia and the second largest in Asia Pacific. But again, the level of investment has not been where it should have been. So in terms of the increasing demand, the relative production is not enough to meet that demand. So what is happening in Indonesia is a drive to increase the amount of oil and gas it can produce domestically. A number of projects there which I've listed, some of which are already on the road, already been started, and some which are still in the planning stage of development. But again, if you look at some of those figures there, you'll see very significant investment levels in refinery construction, for example, in upstream oil, in terms of LNG, which are all required for energy security in Indonesia. Another interesting area in Indonesia is power generation. So if you look at, this is the capacity of power generation capacity in Southeast Asia, and you'll see Indonesia, it looks pretty respectable at around 50 gigawatts. But if you compare that to the per capita power generation capacity, it's not such good news. So relative to the population, Indonesia is way behind in terms of what the power it needs to generate. So this leads to power cuts. Some people still have no power in Indonesia, no electricity. So again, this is another huge area of investment for the government, looking to increase that. Yeah, as I said, there insufficient investment against rising demand of electricity. And if you compare Indonesia with China, China has over 1,000 gigawatts of power generation capacity and just about four times the population. And you can see here, the electrification rate and the increasing demand. So what the government is doing is driving, especially with the new president who came to power in 2014, some ambitious programs to increase the level of power generation capacity in Indonesia, construction of no less than 300 power plants in the country, and also some activities and projects around transmission and distribution. So I think Indonesia is a good example of rising consumer demand, inadequate infrastructure, growing middle class, urbanization. And as I said, it's already the largest economy in Southeast Asia, but its potential is really quite immense over the next 15, 20 years. Okay, I just have a few minutes left, but let me just talk about something more recent, which is the ASEAN Economic Community. So in the news recently, we've been hearing all about economic blocs with Brexit and the European Union. So the ASEAN Economic Community came into being on December the 31st, 2015. So that's about seven months ago. So this is a logical extension of ASEAN. So ASEAN is a political grouping of the Southeast Asian nations. And this initiative is to make the region a more cohesive and more useful economic bloc. So a number of goals around or for the AEC. I think the chief things around the single market and production base, free flow of goods, services, and free flow investment, etc. Some of these will take some time to fully get going, so it's not the finished thing yet in terms of economic integration, but it's a good step on the road. And when people talk about the AEC, it's talked about not, as I said, not as the finished thing now, but very much on the journey, a journey rather than having arrived at the destination. But again, a very important part of the evolution of Southeast Asia for the years ahead. Okay. So let me just summarize and give you some takeaways from the presentation. So I've described, several structurally positive factors for industrial activity and for automation. Already a major manufacturing base, overtaken China in terms of foreign direct investment, large, young, and increasingly affluent population. Again, I think very much the India story, similar to that. A lot of infrastructure investments are required in several countries, particularly Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Myanmar, of course, is a huge rising story with the political settlement last year. Again, extensive natural resources, oil, gas, etc. And again, as the more advanced economies evolve, economies like Singapore, especially Malaysia, Thailand, they will look to automation to remain competitive and as they upgrade their bases, as well, manufacturing bases as well. So I think this is generally a good story, as I said, for industrial activity and for automation as well in Southeast Asia. So that concludes my presentation, and if you have any questions, please see me afterwards, or if you want to send me an email, feel free to do that. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.